Välkomna hit till Apologia live ikväll. Jag heter Martin Helgesson och arbetar för Apologia, Centrum för kristen apologetik. Kvällens program kommer att vara på engelska. Det är knappast en överraskning för er med tanke på rubriken. Rubriken som är How do we reach the next generation? Så jag byter till engelska här och nu och så kör vi därifrån. We are incredibly pleased to have Dr. Rebecca McLaughlin here tonight. Rebecca McLaughlin is originally from England, but is now residing in Massachusetts in the northeastern corner of the US. And her academic background is in Renaissance literature, but over the last few years, she has become one of the most read and appreciated voices when it comes to presenting and explaining Christianity in a way that responds to those familiar challenges that Christianity is facing in the West. And she is perhaps especially known for her book, Confronting Christianity, which received several awards in 2020, not least the Book of the Year from the magazine called Christianity Today. And so, Rebecca, if you would turn your video on, here we go. Welcome to this Apologia live webinar. We're so glad to have you here.
Oh, it's so good. I wish I was actually physically there. I've not been to Sweden, so I would love to.
Oh, well, then that has to go on your bucket list, and we'll hope to see you here in person at some point in the future.
I had my honeymoon in Norway. It was the closest that I've got to your fine country.
It's not too far away, and also very beautiful. Well, thank you so much for coming on today and being with us. And I would like to ask you just a few questions. I think you are, for a lot of our people who are here tonight, and a lot of the people that will hear or watch, hear this on the podcast or watch the video after, and who will buy your book, you're kind of a new name and to most people here in Sweden. So we want to introduce you properly. So if I could ask you about your background in general first, and how did Jesus find you, and how did you become an ambassador for the gospel? And would you mind sharing some of your backstory?
Certainly, I'd love to. In one sense, I have what you could call a boring testimony. I have 3 children, and I very much hope they'll also have boring testimonies, because I don't remember a time when I wasn't a Christian. But in America especially, when people ask, did you grow up in a Christian home? I sort of say, well, kind of yes and kind of no. I came from a family where my mum's family was Catholic historically. My dad's family was the Anglican Church of England. And in both sides of our family, there were some people who went to church because they actually believed, and others who went because it was just, what you did as a person, their time and place and culture. And so I think my parents were actually very much figuring things out for themselves as I was growing up. So I never had that sense, which I think some kids have growing up in Christian families, of, this is my parents' faith and I have to figure out how to make it my faith or not. Mm. It actually always felt like my faith. And I remember, it's fun, my second daughter is 9 right now, and I distinctly remember being 9 years old and being very sure about Jesus. It was at a time of a lot of difficulty in my family, and where I had a strong sense that apart from Jesus, anything in my life could just be gone in 24 hours. And so I knew that Jesus was the only really stable thing then. And I still know that now, a few decades later. So yeah, I grew up in a sort of mixed Christian family, I suppose you could say, and spent a long time in very academic educational environment, so both through school. I don't know, in the US they say high school for the sort of older part of school. In England we call it school, and then university, it's already anyway. My education from let's say 11 to 25 was in very academic environments where Christianity was seen as somewhat bizarre. There was the sort of cultural Christian heritage.
Sure.
But in terms of actual Christian faith, that was very much exceptional. So for almost as long as I can remember, I've been having conversations with really intelligent people who have principled moral and academic objections to Christianity. and trying to explain to them why I think that actually the more closely you look, the more compelling Jesus becomes.
Thank you. And how did it become so it sounds like then you had to be almost an ambassador for your faith, in your personal and academic life. How did you become more of a public figure in that sense? Started speaking and writing. How did that happen?
I did a fair bit of speaking in the UK. Just even growing up, it was something. I always wanted to talk about Jesus, and I had a sort of training in public speaking. So I thought that maybe I would end up doing some sort of evangelism, in a more public way. I stayed on in college to do a PhD after my undergrad because there were so many opportunities to tell people about Jesus, especially I was at Cambridge University, people were coming from all over the world, really intelligent people, many of them with very little exposure to Christianity or certainly not to a kind of compelling Christian witness. Played football with a woman from Sweden, for example.
Oh, really?
So I stayed, stayed in university mostly for that, honestly. Much as I loved studying Shakespeare, it was more of a nice to have. And then at the end of that, went to seminary, theological college for 3 years. Right at the end of my PhD, I met a guy from Oklahoma in America who was the only sort of very seriously Christian man to ask me out, who wasn't a sort of complete social dud. I'll leave it to your imagination. But I grew up in a academic world with lots of mathematicians, and that doesn't always come with finely tuned social skills. So anyway, I ended up dating this guy Brian from Oklahoma, and we got married after my second year in seminary. He was very keen to move back to the US. And so, which frankly, I didn't want to at all. I didn't want to leave my homeland or my family and friends. I especially didn't want to leave a relatively gospel poor country for a more gospel rich country.
Sure.
So moving from England to America seemed like a very strange thing. But I figured to myself that all other things being equal, making a sacrifice for another Christian usually doesn't put you too far outside God's plan for your life.
That's
so
true.
I thought, okay, we'll try America. And I ended up spending 9 years working for something called the Veritas Forum, where I was meeting Christian professors in top universities from across the world in fields as diverse as sort of philosophy and history and science and psychology. And after that, I felt like I had a roadmap of where the real conversations were at in terms of Christianity in the academic world. And I think, sadly, a lot of Christian sort of apologetics has happened in its own little bubble, where people have been able to make claims that honestly just wouldn't stand up in court in the university. But rather than that being a depressing reality, I actually think it's a very hopeful reality, because when we look in the university itself, we find serious followers of Jesus at the top of every single field that's supposed to have disproved or discredited the Christian faith. So I got to know some of those people, and then I wrote Confronting Christianity to try and share their insights, stories, and research with the public.
Yeah. Well, great. We're very, very thankful that you chose to do that. And you've already mentioned this move from the UK to the US, and obviously through the Veritas Forum, you've met, and in other settings, you've met people from all over the world. And now Sweden is a small country. We are very influenced by both the US and the UK. What's your how do you perceive similarities and differences when it comes to the challenges or obstacles to Christian faith in Europe versus America? And do you think they're largely the same, or?
Yeah, I think they're pretty close, though in some areas the sort of things are dialed up or down. It's the same. It's the same sort of sounds, but the exact balance of what's louder and softer depends on where you are. So, for example, in America, I think questions around race are understandably huge and extremely important. And I think, especially white evangelicals like myself, I think have historically done a really poor job, both of obedience to the scriptures when it comes to race and of actually speaking compellingly today. I think our Black brothers and sisters have done a lot better. So that's an especially big issue in America relative to the UK. Not that we don't have problems with racism in the UK, but
Of course. Mm-hmm.
the reality is in the UK we outsourced slavery to other places rather than kind of we made money off the backs of slavery in other nations rather than having slavery in our own country. So it's just had slightly different implications. I think questions around sexuality are very acute in both countries, and my guess is perhaps even more acute in Sweden, where you guys are. I know
it's definitely dialed up. To use that metaphor. Yeah.
I think what's strange to me in the US is meeting cultural evangelical Christians, because in the UK our cultural Christianity is sort of traditional Anglican or Catholic. It's it's not serious like what you can meet. A lot of people in the UK, and my best friend here keeps having to remind me that actually a lot of Americans who sound like evangelicals are in fact not converted. And it's so weird to me because I expect to only hear things about Jesus in that kind of language from people who are very committed believers. But in America, you can be a cultural evangelical, which is actually kind of a scary thing.
Yeah, it is. You're right, and that's interesting. Okay, well, tonight we're going to hear you speak. You're going to give a presentation, but this is also sort of a digital book release. And well, first of all, congratulations on the great success you've had with your writing over the last few years. As I mentioned before, Confronting Christianity was a huge hit, and now we have chosen to start out with translating your second book, 10 Questions Every Teen Should Ask and Answer About Christianity. So what prompted you to write that second book, and what are you hoping it will accomplish?
So Confronting Christianity was intentionally written to relatively educated adults. And my guess was that certain kinds of teenagers would be able to read Confronting Christianity and really appreciate it. But you'd have to be a relatively sort of academically minded teenager to do so. Mm-hmm. And I have 3 children who are currently 11, 9, and 3. And my 11 and 9-year-olds, who were, I suppose, sort of 9 and 7 at that time, were already encountering in school all the kinds of things that I was talking about in Confronting Christianity. And having, especially my younger daughter, is a very insightful questioner. And so she would ask me questions that I've heard from adults all my life, but you don't always expect to hear out of the mouth of a 7-year-old. And I thought, you know what? I think there is a need for a book for younger people addressing these questions. Now, there was some debate as to whether it should be called 10 Questions Every Teen Should Ask or 10 Questions Every Kid Should Ask, which in America, kid is a very, my husband calls like anyone under 25 a kid.
Right.
So it's sort of not
so
like
broad.
child, at least in English.
Yeah.
I wrote that book actually with sort of 10 to 14-year-olds, especially in mind. But I think there are quite a lot of older teens who would find it much more helpful. And conversely, there are some teens who'd find Confronting Christianity more helpful. But what I wanted to do is to take the same ideas and insights and even stories of academics I'd worked with in Confronting Christianity and just bring it to a more accessible level. It also, interestingly, in the 2 years between writing the first and writing the second, the transgender conversation had moved on significantly.
Yeah.
So I devoted a little bit more time and attention to that in the kids' book or the teens' book than I did in the first book. Right.
Well, we're very happy that you wrote it, and we are very happy to release it in Swedish this very month, actually. So shelves are filling up at our distributor, I think, this week. We have orders that are waiting to be dispatched. And I want to say to everyone who's joined in here tonight that if you have a teenager in your life, make sure to order at least one copy and put under the Christmas tree, because it's really worth reading. And my oldest daughter is turning 11 soon. And so I think we need to get a little further into the Harry Potter books, because I noticed there are a couple of spoilers there that we're not ready for. But after that,
my diagnostic tool is if your kids are ready for all the Harry Potter books, they're ready for this book.
Yeah, it's quite helpful, actually.
If they haven't read it yet, then I'll spoil it with the many spoilers in the book. But yeah, that's the diagnostic tool.
You've been warned if you're listening to this. There are some spoilers in there. Okay, well, with that, I think we're ready for the main presentation here, and the topic for that will also relate to the book, right? How do we reach the next generation? And I think, if I'm correct, you are going to point us to 4 areas that Christians need to reclaim. So over to you, and after your presentation, we'll be happy to forward some questions for you.
Okay, yeah. I'm actually going to start with Harry Potter because, being English, I can't help talking about Harry Potter.
Why wouldn't you?
And I'm going to start with a terrible Harry Potter spoiler. So if you have been foolish enough in your life thus far not to read Harry Potter, then, block your ears and open them again in a couple of minutes. And after this, rush away and start reading J.K. Rowling's wonderful books. So in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, J.K. Rowling sticks a knife to her readers' hearts. Throughout the series, Professor Dumbledore has been sort of the Gandalf of the series, if you're more of a J.R.R. Tolkien person. He's the only man whose power for good can match Lord Voldemort's evil. But in the 6th book, a weakened Dumbledore stands at the top of the astronomy tower, surrounded by his enemies, and he appeals to Harry's teacher nemesis, Severus Snape, for help. He says, "Severus, please." And Snape kills him. The scene is completely devastating. We never liked Professor Snape, but we hope beyond hope that he was Dumbledore's man. And now his betrayal of his mentor is complete. It's not until the last book of the series that we realize that we got our understanding of that scene completely wrong. When Harry extracts memories from the dying Snape's mind and he pours them into this pensieve, this magical bowl where you can look into somebody else's past. And there we find that everything that Snape has done has been driven by his passionate, hopeless, unrequited love for Harry's mother. We see Snape's anguish when Lily Potter is murdered by Voldemort. We see how he thenceforth commits himself to Dumbledore. We hear Dumbledore telling Snape that he is dying from the slow workings of an irreversible curse and making Snape promise to kill him when the moment comes. And suddenly the meaning of Severus, please, is reversed. When our non-Christian friends look over at the Christian faith, they see an awful lot of things that look like Snape killing Dumbledore. They see a white-centered religion with a history of racism and scriptures that condone slavery. They see an anti-intellectual mindset and a contradictory Bible that's been disproved by science again and again. They see homophobia, the denigration of women, and a refusal to acknowledge that love is love. But I think if we look at any of these perceptions more carefully, we realize that rather than being terrible roadblocks to faith in Jesus, they actually become signposts. Just as Harry's understanding of what Snape was doing completely changed when he understood more of his story, I think if we look more closely, and if we can invite our friends to look more closely, we'll realize that precisely the opposite of their perceptions is true. So in our little time this evening, I want to suggest that in order to capture the opportunity before us, there are 4 things that we need to do. We must reclaim diversity, we must reclaim the university, we must reclaim morality, and we must reclaim sexuality. But we must do all these things with humility, and not by watering the Bible down, but by lapping it up. So the first thing we must do is reclaim diversity. On February the 23rd of 2019, a Nigerian street preacher named Oluwole Ilasanmi stood outside a train station in London, where I come from, preaching to the commuters as they went by. And 2 white British police officers came up to him and gave him a choice. He could go away or be arrested. "I will not go away," Mr. Ilasanmi replied, "because I need to tell them the truth. And Jesus is the only way, the truth, and the life." "Nobody wants to listen to that," said the police officers. "They want you to go away." "You don't want to listen to that?" Mr. Ilasanmi replied. "You will listen when you are dead. You will listen when you are dead." And so he was arrested. What do we make of this? Are we encouraged by our brother's faith? I certainly am. Are we reminded that preaching the gospel always comes at a cost, and that we Christians in the West have actually got far too used to a comfortable life, for sure? But a Black African street preacher proclaiming the exclusive message of Jesus while white Westerners block their ears is a little parable for the religious world today. You see, 40 years ago, most sociologists of religion believed that as the world became more modern, it would become less religious, and that over time, Christianity would actually decline. It was what had happened in Western Europe, and so the logic went, where Western Europe leads, the rest of the world must follow, right? But in the last 40 years, we have seen the failure of that secularization hypothesis. And not only is it the case today that religion has failed to decline as people thought that it would as the world became more modern, more educated, more scientific, but actually, as experts now look out over the next 40 years to 2060, they're anticipating an increasingly religious world. So right now, Christianity is the largest global belief system, with about 31% of the world identifying as Christians. Now, of course, not all of them are going to be serious followers of Jesus, if we just compare like with like in terms of identification. That proportion is set to increase slightly by 2060 to about 32%. Meanwhile, Islam, the second largest belief system in the world, is set to increase significantly from about 25% to 31%, making it a very close competitor with Christianity. Hinduism and Buddhism are both set to decline slightly. And here's the real shock. The proportion of people who are not affiliated with any global religion, so that includes atheists, agnostics, and people who would just select none if they were giving us census and asked, which religion do you affiliate with? That proportion is set to decrease from about 16% to about 13%. So the world isn't actually becoming less religious, it's becoming more. Now this comes as a shock, I think, to our non-Christian friends. But what's perhaps even more surprising is that Christianity is the belief system of diversity. So today, that 31% of the world who identify as Christians, that represents the most diverse group in terms of racial, cultural, and geographic spread. Today, China is the global center of atheism, but experts believe that there'll be more Christians in China than in America by 2025. And some leading experts of sociology of religion in China even think that China could be a majority Christian country by 2060. So the tide isn't going out on Christianity, it's actually coming in. What's more, by 2060, about 40% of the world's Christians could be living in sub-Saharan Africa. And we see this extraordinary diversity sort of across the world. And even, I certainly see it in my local community here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So I live in Cambridge, in Somerville, which is the adjacent city. English is the third most commonly spoken language at evangelical churches, after Portuguese and Creole. It's extraordinary diversity of God's people. Now, this should excite us, but it shouldn't at all surprise us. Because the first century Jewish man we worship broke through every racial and cultural barrier of his day, and he commanded his disciples to go and make disciples of all nations. They began at once. We see the first Black Christian in the book of Acts, the Ethiopian eunuch, whose individual conversion story we read there. And we learn that Ethiopia actually went on to become one of the earliest countries to officially declare itself to be Christian. Before St. Patrick ever came to Ireland, centuries before the gospel came to America. So this idea people have that Christianity is at heart a sort of white Western religion wasn't true in the beginning and isn't true now. And if we look at the scriptures, we have this promise that in the book of the Revelation, that one day people from every tribe and tongue and nation will worship Jesus together. This is our destiny. And in many ways, it is becoming our reality. Now, when my non-Christian friends hear the word evangelism, they tend to imagine white Westerners forcing their beliefs down other people's throats. But that perception has to change when they realize that most evangelicals actually are not white Westerners. And increasingly, most evangelists are not white Westerners. And at that point, the exclusive message of Jesus becomes harder to dismiss. Because when Olawale Elasanmi said that Jesus is the only way, the truth, and the life, he wasn't saying my culture's cooking is better than yours. He was saying I was starving too until I found bread. So that's the first thing that we must do as we reach out to this next generation. We must reclaim diversity. The second thing I think we must do is to reclaim the university. Now, a good friend of mine from grad school in Cambridge is now a professor at Harvard University. He's so intelligent that he's not a professor just in one department in the sort of world of science. He's a professor of the natural sciences. And a few years ago, I took him to an event at Harvard in which the agnostic chair of the Harvard philosophy department was in dialogue with N.T. Wright, well-known British New Testament scholar you guys may well have come across. And the title of the event was The Bible, Gospel, Guide, or Garbage. And after the event, I said to my friend, I know that you think that what I believe is crazy. And his then girlfriend, who was much sort of gentler soul than either of us, said, oh, I'm sure he doesn't think that. I said, yes, he does. I believe that the entirety of human history revolves around a first century Jewish man who died on a cross and was supposedly raised to life 3 days later. Crazy, right? My friend agreed. I said, the problem is, I think that some of the things that you believe are crazy too. So our non-Christian friends think that they are looking over at Christianity with all its crazy beliefs, and that there's a perfectly coherent secular worldview that does all the work that Christianity does for them, does for us, but without them having to believe in crazy things like rising from the dead. And there really is no such belief system. And in the next generation, I think the university is going to have to reckon with Christianity again. You see, for many decades now, this idea that the world is becoming less religious and that Christianity is declining and that it is allied only with sort of a white Western mindset that's crumbling away, that functioned in at least the Western academic world, not just as a diagnosis, but also as a prescription. So it wasn't just what would happen, but it's what should happen. So what are Western academics going to do when they realize that it hasn't happened? And the atheism, far from being the belief system of diversity, is actually the belief system of predominantly white Western men and communist regimes. There's a guy named Fangang Yang, who's one of the leading experts of sociology of religion in China. He's based at Purdue University in America. And he says that there's going to have to be a paradigm shift in the university, much like a scientific revolution. That's his language, not mine. When the failure of the secularization hypothesis comes home to roost. Now, again, this should excite us, but it shouldn't surprise us. Because Christians actually invented what we now call the university. And universities like Harvard and Yale and Oxford and Cambridge were founded in order to bring glory to Christ. You know, Jesus calls us to love God with all our heart and our soul and our mind and our strength. He's not content with 3 out of 4. And if we look back over the last 2,000 years, we find that Christianity is actually the greatest intellectual movement in all of history. As I mentioned in the interview earlier, I had the privilege over 9 years of meeting some of the world's leading scholars in fields as diverse as sort of physics to philosophy to psychology to history, who are very serious followers of Jesus. And the idea that if you actually take the academic world seriously and if you pursue truth in that world, that you're going to be walking further and further away from Jesus is actually completely wrong. In fact, as I mentioned, Christians sort of invented the modern university. Some of the greatest philosophy of all time has been dreamt up by Christians. Some of the greatest literature of all time has been written by Christians. And perhaps most surprisingly to our non-Christian friends, what we now call science was discovered, invented, constructed by Christians not as an alternative hypothesis to belief in a creator God, but actually because they believed in a creator God who was both rational and free. And the guy I really learned this from is a man named Hans Halvorsen, who is a professor of philosophy of science at Princeton University. He's probably one of the top 4 philosophers of science in the world, extremely well respected. And he says that not only is it the case historically that Christians first developed what we now see as the modern scientific method, but that even today, Christianity gives science a firmer philosophical foundation than atheism. In fact, he says atheism doesn't give you a philosophical foundation for science at all. So let's not surrender science to atheism. Let's reclaim the university in this next generation, not as a hostile takeover, but as a homecoming. Let's find the thousands of Christian professors whom God has raised up in universities across the world, and let's learn from them. Because Christianity is not anti-intellectual. It's the greatest intellectual movement in all of history. Third, we must reclaim morality. Now, in the last couple of years, I've read some really interesting books by atheist and agnostic historians. And they have confirmed me in the belief that moral truths that you and I see as self-evident today often, and that certainly our non-Christian friends see as just sort of basic moral common sense, are in fact specifically Christian beliefs. I'll show you a couple of those books now. So one is this book by a British historian named Tom Holland. It's called, in America, it's called Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. In the UK, when this comes from, it's called Dominion, the Making of the Western Mind. Tom Holland grew up in the UK in a sort of culturally, Anglican family, but he completely lost interest in God as a kid. He found the Greek and Roman gods far more attractive than the seemingly pathetic hero of Christianity. And he became a professional historian, wrote a number of historical books. And in this book, he's looking back to sort of fat volume. He's looking back over the last 2,000 years of Christian history in the West. And what he concluded from his research is that things that we see as self-evident moral truths, for example, that all human beings are fundamentally morally equal, the strong and the rich and the powerful shouldn't trample on the weak and the poor and the marginalized, that women are fundamentally equal to men, that sex should be consensual. All these sorts of things that we see as just sort of basic moral common sense are in fact specifically Christian beliefs. And I don't know if he is quite fully publicly identifying as a Christian yet, but he's at least extremely close from his historical research. So that's Tom Holland. Here's another example. Yuval Noah Harari, an Israeli historian who I believe identifies as atheist, wrote this global bestseller, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind. In it, he makes statements like this: Homo sapiens have no natural rights, just as chimpanzees, hyenas, and spiders have no natural rights. He says that human rights are a figment of our fertile imaginations. They have embarrassingly little to do with the scientific study of Homo sapiens. He says the Americans got the idea of equality from Christianity, but given that we no longer believe in the Christian myths about creation and God making humans in his own image, why would we still believe that human beings are equal? He makes all these points which are, on the one hand, extremely incisive and compelling, and on the other hand, almost painful to read, because whereas Tom Holland seems to have this sort of sense of lament and longing for a belief that would ground these, a belief system would ground these moral truths, Yuval Noah Harari seems to be okay with just recognizing they have no grounding. It's a little bit like, I don't know if you guys in Sweden play the game Jenga, but at least in the UK and the US, there's this game where you sort of pile up these little wooden blocks, and you have to try and pull blocks out from lower in the structure and put them on the top. And the art is sliding a block out without knocking down the whole tower. And I think for many of our non-Christian friends, we might recognize, maybe Jesus had something to do with the way that our moral beliefs have been shaped today, but we can definitely sort of slide that little block out of the bottom of the moral tower and maybe build an even higher tower without it. In fact, if we pull Jesus out of the moral tower, it's not like sliding a little Jenga block out. It's like pulling the pin on a grenade. Everything goes up in smoke before our eyes. This was a realization that dawned on one of the few people who knew both me and my husband before we knew each other. So when I first knew Sarah Irving Stonebreaker, she was doing a PhD in history at Cambridge University, and she knew my husband, or my now husband, better than she knew me, but I knew her a little bit. Sarah was a convinced atheist when she came to Cambridge to do her PhD. She was a convinced atheist when she went to Oxford to do her postdoc. But while she was at Oxford, she went to a series of lectures delivered by a fellow Australian. She's an Australian woman named Peter Singer. And Peter Singer is one of the atheist philosophers who takes very seriously the fact that we can't just assume that all human beings are morally equal on the basis of them being human. He instead proposes that we evaluate beings, whether they're human or otherwise, on the basis of certain capacities. For example, the capacity to suffer, the capacity to be self-reflective, etc. And according to Singer's calculation, a human infant is less morally valuable than an adult pig. And as my friend Sarah heard these lectures, she experienced what she later described as sort of intellectual vertigo, as she realized that all her deepest moral beliefs were completely unsupported by her atheism. And she ended up a few years later becoming a Christian. You see, she had thought that Christianity was against universal human rights and care for the poor and equality for men and women. And in fact, she realized it was the basis for those things. So in this next generation, without self-righteousness, because we can't become a Christian and hold on to our pride and our sense of our own rightness, and we certainly can't proclaim Jesus holding on to that either. But shedding our self-righteousness, let's reclaim morality, like divers pulling treasure from a wreck. And let's flee self-righteousness like toxic waste, because Christianity is actually the greatest movement for justice in all of history. And without Christianity, we don't even know what justice is. And finally, last but not least, as we say in England, we must reclaim sexuality. When Snape killed Dumbledore, all doubt in the reader's mind as to whether he was on the side of good or evil died as well. And when you and I stand for Christian sexual ethics in our cultural environments today, we move over in people's minds from delusion to bigotry. We're not just sort of foolish for believing what we do, we're actually morally wrong. But just as when Harry dived into Snape's memories, he realized that Snape's story was a story of love, not of hate. So I think that when we dive into what the Bible says about sexuality, we find that it's a love story too. The love story begins in the Old Testament, as prophet after prophet compares God to a faithful, loving husband and Israel to an often unfaithful wife. It comes into new focus in the New Testament when Jesus steps onto the stage of human history and declares that he is the bridegroom. It finds even greater clarity when Paul explains in his letter to the Ephesians that human marriage is like a little scale model of Jesus's love for his church. And the love song rises to a full-blown crescendo in the book of Revelation when a great multitude shouts out, "The wedding of the Lamb has come." And Jesus' marriage to his church brings heaven and earth back together. This is why Christian marriage is male and female, and why husbands and wives are called to different roles. Like Christ in the church, it's a love across a difference. Like Christ in the church, it's a love built on sacrifice. Like Christ in the church, it's a life-creating, flesh-uniting, never-ending, exclusive love. Marriage is meant to point us to Christ. But it's also meant to disappoint us. Because if even the greatest human romance could only ever be a tiny echo of Jesus' love for us. Now, I think one of the great ironies of the last generation is that the sexual revolution of the 1960s was sold to us as the liberation of women. For centuries, men had been finding ways to sort of sneak around Christian marriage and have commitment-free sex. And now, great news, thanks to the pill, women could do as well. But in the 60-odd years since the sexual revolution, at least in America, women's self-reported happiness has actually declined, despite increases in freedom and opportunities and many good things. Why is this? I think a lot of the reason is actually commitment-free sex is a poison chalice. So there's a lot of research has been done that has shown that stable marriage is correlated for both men and women with positive mental and physical health outcomes. But for women in particular, actually, increasing our numbers of sexual partners is correlated with negative mental health outcomes. So whether it's increased levels of depression, suicidal ideation, drug abuse, alcoholism, you name it. Having multiple sexual partners turns out to be sort of meaningfully bad for women. We were offered the sort of elixir of life, and we were in fact handed a poison chalice by the sexual revolution. So we mustn't lose our confidence in Christian marriage. At the same time, we must recognize that married love is not the only kind of love that points us to Jesus' love for us. What did Jesus say to his disciples? Greater love has no one than this, than that he laid down his life for his friends. Now, we might have thought he'd end that sentence, greater love has no one than this, than that he love his wife or love his children. But actually, it's the laying down of life for your friends that Jesus says is as good as any other kind of human love. And one of the things that I've come to understand as someone who, all my life, as long as I can remember, I've been a Christian, as long as I can remember, I've been attracted to women. And if I were not a Christian, I think it's highly likely I'd be married to a woman today rather than being married to a man. But rather than Christianity offering us a sort of vision for love that is only male-female, actually Christianity offers us a particular vision for male-female love and marriage, and another different and equally beautiful vision for love and friendship, which is not exclusively same-sex, but actually predominantly, and I think often in its best form, love between people of the same sex. And I think one of the things that we need to do, if we are going to reclaim the next generation for Jesus, is to reclaim fierce, abiding, non-erotic, non-romantic love. We need to recognize the beauty of friendship, not setting it up as a sort of pseudo-marriage with all the necessary exclusivity of marriage, but actually as something that is equally beautiful and by definition inclusive. And I think we have a great opportunity to do that and to recognize that the primary family unit for Christians is actually not mum and dad and 2.4 kids. The primary family unit is the church. Now, you may hear all of this and think, I must be a very strange sort of person to be someone who's predominantly attracted to women, but married to a man. Isn't that sort of very odd thing to be? I am kind of strange, but not for that reason. There are other weird things about me. It turns out, and I'm taking this research from a woman who is herself a lesbian, not a Christian at all, a professor at University of Utah named Lisa Diamond, who says that about 14% of women experience significant same-sex attraction, but only about 1% of women are exclusively attracted to other women to where they couldn't be in a sexual relationship with a man. And for men, it's about 7% who experience same-sex attraction, about 2% who are exclusively same-sex attracted. So this idea that many of us have been brought up on, that you're kind of either gay or straight, and that's just sort of something fixed from infancy, doesn't actually map onto the current research. Because what Lisa Diamond's also found is that a lot of people experience change through their lives in any direction. So whether that's someone who's been predominantly same-sex attracted who then finds themselves attracted to folks of the opposite sex, or the other way around. It's a very sort of, we human beings are very messy, and actually far harder to fit into boxes in terms of our patterns of attraction. And one of the things that says to me is that actually all of us are to some extent in the same boat if we're Christians. I can't see your faces, and if I could, I wouldn't ask you to raise your hand. But if I did ask you to raise your hand, if you have ever been attracted to somebody you're not married to, my guess is basically everybody on this call will be sort of giving me a little wave. The question for us is not, are you ever attracted to somebody you're not married to, but will we submit our attractions to Christ? And I think one of the things that we must do in order to reclaim this next generation for the gospel is actually to discover the same-sex attracted brothers and sisters within our churches, within our networks and environments, who have decided to trust Jesus with their sexuality. Because there's actually no more powerful way to witness in this generation than to sacrifice sexual or romantic fulfillment because we believe in a better love. The same-sex attracted believers in our congregations are not an embarrassment, they're actually an asset. Because our generation is sort of blocking its ears to the gospel because of this issue, and our same-sex attracted brothers and sisters are like a God-given SWAT team to burst through those defenses. So let's reclaim sexuality in this next generation. Let's reclaim Christian friendship as a real and meaningful thing. Let's reclaim the church as the primary family unit, and let's invite people into that. Because there's actually no deeper longing in people's hearts than to be part of a real family. And that is something that we as Christians, in our imperfect, sinful, messed up ways, can do as we reach out with Jesus' love to those around us. So just to recap those 4 points, we must reclaim diversity, we must reclaim the university, we must reclaim morality, and we must reclaim sexuality, but we must do all of these things with humility. We must repent of the ways in which we've allowed racism to thrive in our churches. We must repent of the ways in which we've abandoned the life of the mind. And we must repent of self-righteousness. And we must repent of the actual homophobia that's meant that our brothers and sisters who experience same-sex attraction have found themselves sort of huddling in the cold, feeling like they're alone and unwanted and unloved. We need to take a hard turn away from ourselves and a hard turn towards the scriptures, because Jesus is not a relic of the ancient world. He truly is our modern world's best hope. I'd love to hear any of your questions. I know I've covered a lot of territory there.
Well, thank you so much, Rebecca. Yes, you did cover a lot of territory. So there's a lot to come back to and follow up on, I think, for all of us as we think about perhaps what some of this will look like in sort of fleshed out in a concrete application. I think there are lots to ask about there, and well, who knows what questions you might have. And if you do have a question, what you want to do is find the Q&A button that's at the bottom of your Zoom window. And when you press that, you will have a separate window open where you type in your question, and then you can send it in. And I will read questions to Rebecca. And I do want to give you a few pointers. Make sure it's a question that you type in. Make sure it's brief. It's so much easier for me to moderate and keep up with the questions if they are quick to read. And also, if you don't have a question of your own, you can click on the Q&A button and upvote or vote for questions that others have typed in. And so I will typically pick questions that are at the top of the pile. Sometimes I will take other questions. Sometimes I will add questions on my own. But that's what I typically do. Oh, the first question is not a question. It's just someone who's very grateful. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Well, those kinds of comments are allowed as well. But please open the Q&A portion or the Q&A panel now and start sending in your questions. I think I will open with a question of my own.
Well, we have a question, I think, from Wesley Santos. I'm seeing it in the Q&A.
Yes, sorry. I was in the chat window. Here I am not following my own instructions. That's really bad. Here we go. Wesley has a question. Great talk, Rebecca. Thank you. What do you think about the progressive views on sexuality and marriage that some Christians have been taking?
A very important question. And the most brief answer, which I will elaborate on, is that I think they're tragically wrong. Why do I say that? I, as someone who's always been attracted to other women, if I could have read the scriptures in a way that allowed for same-sex marriage, I would have done. My best friend, I wanted the chance to wave around this book because it's a wonderful book by a woman named Rachel Gilson, who happens to go to my church, but in God's providence happens to go to my church. I sort of found her there. And she became a Christian when she was an undergrad at Yale University, having been identified as an atheist, having been in multiple lesbian relationships, with a very sort of settled sense that she was attracted to women rather than men. And when she was first exploring Christianity, sort of much to her own surprise, after stealing a copy of C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity from a lapsed Catholic friend's sort of bookshelf, she went to the only Christians she knew who were a lesbian couple and asked them, hey, how do you fit together believing in Jesus with being in a relationship with another woman? And her friends gave her this little sort of pamphlet explaining how there's been this big misunderstanding and that actually the Bible doesn't say that marriage can only be male-female. And my friend Rachel read this pamphlet with like great eagerness and enthusiasm because she was getting more and more attracted to Jesus. And so she was thinking, this is great. This is what I've been looking for. She then started looking up the Bible passages that this pamphlet was supposedly explaining to her. And she ended up throwing the pamphlet across the room. She was so angry because even though she was no Bible scholar, she could read. And she realized that actually they were not in any way faithfully representing what the Bible was saying. Now, since then, that was about 16 years ago, since then, Rachel has gone on to study theology. She's learnt the Bible in Greek and Hebrew. She's spent a lot of time specifically studying questions around sexuality in the Bible. And she's even more convinced today that the Bible does not allow for sex outside of male-female marriage. And yet, she's even more convinced that Jesus is worth giving up your sort of sexual or romantic fulfillment for. So what do I think about progressive views on sexuality and marriage? I think they are often attempting to be kind and in fact being very cruel because they're telling people that they can have Jesus and sexual immorality, unrepentant sexual immorality, and we can't. So I think they're ultimately, and again, I think often with the best motives. I'm not saying that I think people are intending to do harm, but I think often with the best motives, they're lying to people or telling them untrue things about what God says. Now, I'll wrap up very soon, but one of the things that people often say is like, how unfair to expect people who experience same-sex attraction, even those who exclusively experience same-sex attraction, how unfair to expect them to give that up to follow Jesus. And I have to tell you, Jesus said that anyone who wants to come after him must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow him. If we have a gospel that is sort of sacrifice-free, if we're telling people become a Christian and keep everything you ever wanted, we're lying to them. We actually need to be ready to give up everything. What we will often find is that God gives us something even more beautiful than what we sacrificed, whether in this life or the next. And there are many ways in which I have personally experienced that in my life of just seeing, wow, I thought I was grasping for something good or giving up something that I desperately wanted, and God has somehow met the desires of my heart in another way. So I don't think God is cruel and miserly at all. I think he's extraordinarily generous, but he also calls us to give up everything to follow Jesus.
Thank you so much. I really loved your analogy of same-sex attracted Christians as a God-given SWAT team. I had to type it down, your testimony and Rachel Gilson's as well, and people that I know on a personal level. It really speaks in a unique way, I think, to our time. So thank you. Okay, next question comes from Hannah. How do we, in a concrete way, reclaim the universities? Great talk, by the way.
Thank you, Hannah. I think one thing we do is those of us who have children, and I'm a firm believer that Christian marriage is a wonderful thing, but just to anyone on this call who is single, you are not in God's kingdom any kind of second-class citizen. In fact, if we actually read what the Bible says, you may be a first-class citizen, and those of us who are married may be second-class citizens. But those of us who have children, or those of us in influence over children, whether it's nephews and nieces, kids at your church, however you're connected, whether you're a teacher, we should be raising our children to be the most intellectually curious folks in town. Again, I think especially in America, and I'm curious whether this translates into Sweden as well, but I think especially in America, there's been a history in the last couple of 100 years of basically not expecting much from Christians in terms of their brains, and buying into this idea that Christianity is anti-intellectual. And again, it's come from a well-meaning place, because it's people wanting to say, the gospel is simple enough for a child to understand, or for somebody with a learning disability to wrap their minds around. And that's true. But the Bible is also the most extraordinarily, beautifully challenging and complex collection of books that absolutely demand every ounce of our intellectual capacities. And so I think in the long-term project of reclaiming the universities, we need to raise our kids with real intellectual aspirations. I think we also need to find the Christians. So that's the sort of, the long-term play. The short-term play is God's already raised these people up, actually. There are thousands of Christian professors across the world, and we just don't know who they are. They are, to my mind, the greatest untapped resource of the global church. And one of the things I most enjoy is sort of ferreting these people out and making their stories available to a wider world. But so often, and again, I don't personally know any Christian professors in Sweden, but I'm sure there are. So we find those people, we learn from them, we make them folks who we as Christians look to for inspiration and for education, actually.
Thanks. Okay, we have an anonymous question here. Today, Christians are seen as haters by non-Christians because of our moral views. How can we answer that?
Yeah. I think two ways. One is to recognize the extent to which the critiques are true, which is hard for us. It shouldn't be hard, because we Christians, we should be really good at repenting. It should be in our DNA. To repent and believe is how we come to Christ, right? So we should actually be quick to recognize when we personally or our communities, sort of corporately, have acted in hateful ways toward others. That is true if we look back at the history of, for example, in America, and I'm sorry to keep citing American examples, but I sadly don't know Swedish history enough to translate, but I'm sure you guys do. So in American history, for example, there needs to be a repentance and recognition of the ways in which white Christians have treated Black Americans hatefully. There also needs to be a recognition of the ways in which Christians have treated gay and lesbian people hatefully, both outside the church and inside. And as much as I was saying earlier, that the Bible is very clear when it comes to where sex belongs, and that's only in male-female marriage. That is in no way a license for us as Christians to act unlovingly toward gay and lesbian folk. Actually, quite the opposite. We should be the most loving. And in fact, our histories have not looked like that. So when we're seen as hateful, I think one thing we can do is repent and apologize. But we also need to recognize and model the fact that disagreement and hostility are not the same thing. In fact, for Christians, they cannot be the same thing, because Jesus calls us to love even our enemies. And most of us as Christians in the West, we don't really know what it means to be opposed as Christians. Yes, we may experience some, like our friends may be unimpressed with us. We may lose some friendships. We might possibly even lose a job for our Christian beliefs. But our brothers and sisters around the world are getting hauled off to prison or beheaded. And that was more the situation into which the New Testament was written, with those very real possibilities. And it was in that context that Jesus said that we must love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. So when we are seen as being hateful, we need to double down both on truth and on love. Now, people will still see us as hateful. It's not that Jesus didn't say, look forward to the day when everybody speaks well of you. He said people aren't going to speak well of you. But when that happens, when people unfairly speak ill of us, let's make sure that it is unfair and that we are, in fact, trying to extend love upon love upon love in the midst of it.
Thank you. Okay, let's see. Shafir has a question here. How can Rebecca remain optimistic about the future in Europe, where materialism and secularism is currently so strong?
Yeah. I'm an optimist in general, and I'm especially what I might call a gospel optimist. And I don't think that's complete delusion on my part. I think if we look back over the history of the world, we see that the gospel does advance, even in situations where it looks bleak. I think one of the ways in which the gospel is advancing in Europe actually is through immigration and through folks like Olawale Ilasanmi from Nigeria trying to evangelize, white Londoners. It's easy to see immigration as primarily a sort of process that brings folks of other religious backgrounds, especially Muslims, into Western contexts. And that's, to some extent, that's true. And actually, I think it's a great thing because it gives Muslims access to the gospel in ways they may not have had in their home countries. But actually, the majority of immigrants into the West tend to be folks from predominantly Christian places. So I think there's actually a real hope for the church in immigration, sort of ironically, perhaps. And I think ultimately, secularism and materialism are strong, but they are ultimately hopeless. And one of the things that fascinates me about the sociological research that's done on people's religious beliefs is that it's actually quite hard to find multiple generations of non-religious people. Even when we see, the numbers of people who identify as non-religious is growing and growing, it's a very unstable category, especially over generations, because it's no way to live. Research done in America quite recently was looking at suicide rates among women in terms of their religious practice. And women who went to church once a week or more were 5 times less likely to kill themselves than women who never went to church. It's probably like active religious participation is, according to Tyler Vandervelde at the Harvard School of Public Health, is probably the best protective against suicide that we know of. So secularization is usually kind of built to us as this wonderful panacea that's going to make everyone happy and free and healthy, etc. Completely the opposite is in fact true. And even I asked Tyler about the Scandinavian countries, because you guys are always sort of held up as like, look at all these happy secular people.
Oh yeah.
That even in Scandinavian countries, people who regularly participate in religious worship are meaningfully happier and healthier than those who don't.
Great, thank you. It was a good thing I hung out in the chat before, because I did manage to find a question there. What's the most important thing for me to do for my grandchildren as a grandmother?
Pray for them. I'm a real prayer weakling. So people talk about prayer warriors, and I'm sort of the opposite. I'm like prayer puny or something. But the more I go on in the Christian life, the more convinced I am of the importance of prayer and the power of prayer. And I actually know multiple people who would say they're Christians today because their grandmother prayed for them. So don't lose hope. Do pray. And I think there are an increasing number of resources. Sometimes I think it's hard within families to talk about issues directly, but sometimes a book or a video or an interview might just answer some questions that a younger person is having in a less threatening way. I had a lovely story. Somebody messaged me through my website a few months ago saying that she had bought my teens book for her daughter, who was sort of very much finding herself to be skeptical of Christianity. She'd given it to her daughter. Her daughter said she didn't want to read it, and her mother was, a little bit disappointed. And then a couple of days later, her mum the mother saw the daughter sitting on the couch in the living room, actually like reading the book, sort of furtively. And so she left her, she kind of left her be and didn't come in and like try and talk about it. But it seemed like the daughter actually got through quite a book, having said that she definitely didn't want to read it. So I think figuring out what are the issues that maybe are stumbling blocks or roadblocks for your grandchildren, finding a resource that might be helpful to them. Again, I can't recommend my friend Rachel's book highly enough. It's questions around sexuality, extremely good. Yeah, so fielding the team that we have to help people think.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So that was evangelism, so to speak, in the family. How about in the workplace? How do I best evangelize my coworkers? Is a question from David.
Yeah, I mean, that obviously hugely depends on the context that you live in. My husband runs a small company, and he, a couple of weeks ago, he was working with a former employee who sort of had back as a consultant. He said, "Oh, can I give me a copy of your book? I want to give it to my former colleague Z, because now that he's not his boss, he feels more permission to actually try and evangelize him, because there is something, I think we do have to be careful about how we relate to those, directly below us in a sort of structure of a company. So it's very hard to generalize, not knowing the specifics of somebody's work situation. But I think loving folks as best we can, showing a real interest in their lives may well result in them showing an interest in our lives, and giving us an opportunity to talk about our faith in Jesus in an unthreatening way in that context.
Okay, let's see. Again, it's a little bit difficult to keep up with the longer questions, so try and keep them brief. It makes it the job of moderating them a little easier. So I'm looking down in the list here. I want to pose Sophia's question. You mentioned in the beginning that more people confess to Christianity. How come it's not what we normally see? Instead, seeing more people leaving the church. Does it have to do with Christians being afraid to profess their faith?
Yeah, so if I'm understanding that correctly, I think Sophia is saying, we tend to hear about people leaving the church in droves, but here I am saying that actually Christianity is growing globally. How do we put these two together?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think a couple of things. One is that the reason we think that Christianity is declining is because we tend to focus on white men in the West as our sort of index of things. And among that demographic, no offense to my brothers here, Christianity has been declining. What I'm saying is, if we take a global view, and if we look at the Christianity has always been a majority female movement, funnily enough, from the very beginning, and that's absolutely true today. If we look at China at the moment, where the church is growing so fast, it's majority female. So we take a global view, we see the growth of Christianity. I think we do see a lot of people leaving the church in the West. Sometimes that's not even a bad thing, because a lot of kind of cultural Christianity in the West hasn't actually been authentic Christianity. And so if people, and one of the ironies of the last few decades is that a lot of churches that have relinquished Christian sexual ethics and said, okay, to keep up in the modern world, we really need to recognize that we can't be so prescriptive about sex only being in male-female marriage. So, for Christianity to survive in the modern world, we need to affirm gay marriage. Churches that affirm gay marriage actually have significantly declined in the last several decades. So there'll be some instances where people leaving the church may not actually be in and of itself a bad thing, and maybe them recognizing that they're not a Christian, whereas before they might have thought they were when in fact they weren't. And they're also, we tend to hear more in the sort of public sphere about the people leaving the church than we hear about the people coming back. I had a fun, we have a community group on Tuesday nights in our house. And one of the women who joined it about a year ago, 2 years ago, left an engagement to another woman. And she'd been sort of raised in the church, but honestly had never really understood the gospel or been serious in her faith, and has now sort of come back very serious. And we were talking last night in our small group about evangelism. And she was saying, yeah, sometimes it's hard to believe, you maybe have a friend and you're thinking, I can't even imagine them becoming a Christian. Like, it seems so, I don't really have faith enough to imagine this particular person would become a Christian. And I said, yeah, Paige, but like, if I'd met you 3 years ago, I'd have said that of you. Like, you would know, I'd have been like, well, there's no way. I mean, she was engaged to another woman, very much making that a platform issue for her. And here she is, and she sort of laughed out loud. So we don't always hear the stories of people who come in as much as we hear the stories of people who walk out.
Yeah, great. That's a good point. Okay, so I managed to get through this long question at the top, and it's got lots of votes, or a few votes here. So let's tackle it. You speak about abortion in the fourth chapter of your book. When I read it, I thought about truths that are obvious for a Christian, but not at all true in a non-believer's view. I find it hard to speak to non-Christians without presupposing what I'm trying to prove. Some things that we Christians know are based on the Bible. We really know it's the truth, but it's hard to use these biblical truths as arguments in a conversation with a non-believer. I said, I think we can pretty much, we can skip to the end. How can we present biblical truth without getting stuck in this dead end?
Yeah, I think this actually connects back to one of the things I was saying earlier in my talk, which is that our non-Christian friends have no idea how much goes up in smoke when you pull Jesus out.
Right.
So they think, for example, and I actually, my most recent book other than the Christian book is this one's called The Secular Creed, where I'm looking at a chapter on women's rights and human rights, that claim, which is very sort of prevalent here. And a lot of people think when it comes to abortion, that abortion is a fundamental right for women. And that in many ways, it's a sort of the central plank of feminism is the right to abortion. Actually, the central plank of feminism, the reason historically why women have been seen as equal to men and deserving protection, and not just to be used sexually by men, etc. The central plank is the cross. It's actually Jesus and his treatment of women that changed women's rights, that created women's rights in the first place. And so sometimes when we're talking to a non-believer, they might say, I absolutely 100% believe in women's rights, and therefore I think that a woman has a right to abortion. But when we look at the reasons why you might think that an unborn baby has human rights, you find that they're actually the same reasons as why you might think that a woman has rights. And if there is no God, then the baby in the mother's womb is just a collection of cells. But if there is no God, and if Jesus isn't who he says he is, then that's what I am too. And that's what you are too. And again, that's not just me saying it. That's actually, you all know Harare's view that women have no human rights any more than chimpanzees, hyenas, and spiders do. So sometimes, we can get caught in the situation of saying, well, you're only saying this because it's what the Bible says and you believe the Bible and I don't, kind of conversation. But what Tom Holland would say is that actually our non-Christian friends believe the Bible much more than they realize, because a lot of their beliefs have come from the Bible. And if they really want to be serious about taking the Bible out, they maybe need to shed those beliefs as well.
That would be a quite surprising angle to take, I think, as well, which can be helpful sometimes to not respond in the ways that people maybe expect you to, but to actually confirm that not only myself believes in the Bible, but they do as well. I think it's a good angle to take. I want to grab a hold of Eric's question here as well. A question about LGBTQ and the the trans questions. They're hot topics here. Have you written about it in your books? And yes, you did in A Secular Creed. But could you touch or comment on the issue briefly here? How should the church handle this sensitive issue?
Yeah, I have a whole chapter on it in the Secular Creed, which is the most recent thinking I've done on it. Again, here's one of the ironies. The touchstone of progressive belief today is the claim that transgender women are women, i.e., someone who's born biologically male but identifies as a woman is as much of a woman as I am. And famously, it's funny, when I started using J.K. Rowling and the Harry Potter books as illustrations in Confronting Christianity, I thought this is great, because J.K. Rowling is like, everybody loves her, nothing controversial, no political stuff. It's just like everybody loves Harry Potter. And now J.K. Rowling's become this like massively controversial political figure for making the bold claim that in certain contexts only women should be recognized as women. Now, even 5 years ago, that would have been seen as sort of very basic common sense. And certainly, I mean, J.K. Rowling's position is she's fine with people identifying as transgender, wearing whatever clothes they like, having whatever relationships they want, but that in certain contexts, so for example, women's prisons, women's sports, or a shelter for abused women, that only biological females should be allowed. And that has gone from being like extraordinarily standard liberal belief to being cancelable, if that's a word, to being massively controversial. Mm-hmm. What's fascinating at the moment to me is a number of secular liberal feminists, not just like J.K. Rowling, are writing about the ways in which the transgender movement is completely unraveling the women's rights movement. I'm reading one at the moment called Trans, where ideology meets reality, by a woman who's an editor at The Economist, and not writing from a Christian perspective, writing as, again, like a secular liberal feminist, and saying that actually the way that the transgender movement has been rolling out is tearing down things that women have fought for decades. So one of the things that's sort of interesting at the moment is whereas I think the gay rights movement sort of went down very easily in some respects with our secular liberal friends, the transgender rights movement is actually a much more complicated beast, because once you say transgender women are women, we actually have no idea what a woman is. We have lost the definition. Like, there is no stable definition of a woman at all. All we have really is stereotypes at that point. If we remove biology from our definition of a woman, what is a woman? We don't know. And there are all sorts of problems being caused by that. So on the one hand, I think we don't need to recognize there's this like huge ideological churn going on, and I don't know how this is going to play out in the next few years. So yeah, I'm just sort of curious about that. Even as Christian, I almost feel like we Christians sort of sit back and eat some popcorn for a bit, watching what's happening. No, we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't do that at all. There is, at the same time, a bunch of complicated things going on in terms of people's lived experience. So on the one hand, my elder daughter has a good friend who last year came out as non-binary, so identifying as neither male nor female, and over the summer was hospitalized with depression and an eating disorder, aged 11. She sadly is extraordinarily typical of the new phenomenon of adolescent girls identifying as non-binary or transgender in the context of actual other mental health challenges going on that are often being kind of masked by that transgender identity. Because historically, identifying as or having gender dysphoria, having a sense of discomfort with your own sex, has been very much a male phenomenon. It's been something that's been observed in a small number of men from early childhood, that in a number of cases resolves as they grow up, and in some cases doesn't. What's been strange in the last few years is this, what's been called rapid onset gender dysphoria of sort of adolescent girls, especially with no history of discomfort with their sex, suddenly identifying as non-binary or transgender. And I think there's a lot that's very, very concerning happening there. And when I say concerning, I don't just mean in a sort of culture wars and anti-Christian sort of way, but I'm like truly troubling and something that we should care about the young women who are going through this, because it is not putting them on puberty blocking drugs, giving them double mastectomies. These things are not actually in their long-term interest at all. On the other hand, it's easy, I think, for those of us, like me, a sort of Bible-believing Christian who wants to hold firmly to a view that God made us male and female, that those things are good even when they feel uncomfortable to us. It's sometimes easier for us to talk about rapid onset gender dysphoria among adolescent girls and to really focus our attention on that, and to forget the people like my friend Seda, who is a transgender woman, i.e. a biological male who identifies as a woman now, who transitioned both surgically and socially. Seda did this I'm going to say we can have another conversation another time about pronouns and when to use them, but I'm going to say her for a minute here. In her 40s, she was married to another woman, or to a woman with 2 sons, surgically transitioned after a period of intense suicidal ideation, and found that the transition really helped. Like, she would say that it saved her life. This was not something that she did lightly. This was after many, many years, etc., etc. Now, again, I don't think that was ultimately the right decision, but I really want to be in relationship with people like Seda, who force me to confront the really hard cases, and not just to sort of focus on the cases that are easy for me as a Christian to sort of wrestle with. So how can we relate to folks in our communities who identify as transgender? I think love comes first. I think listening to people's stories is super important. I think, foregrounding that, while also holding on to the reality that God made us male and female. And I have another friend who's got 2 kids who were born intersex, with a disorder of sexual development, to where they were at first thought to be female and then turned out to be genetically male, and so the parents had to make a decision as to whether to bring them up as boys or girls. There's some cases where there's real biological complexity that we need to recognize as Christians. So I think we don't want to oversimplify. At the same time, I think we want to hold on to the truth in love.
Thank you so much. And so we can also point you, Eric, to both the book The Secular Creed, and as well the book that we have just translated, because you do have a chapter on trans issues there as well. And I think on that note, it's time for us to conclude here. Rebecca, thank you so much for giving us of your time, and it was a really helpful, interesting, fascinating presentation of yours, and thank you for sticking around to answer all these questions as well.
Can I, Martin, in just 30 seconds, answer the question from anonymous attendee, which is, what can you say to conservative Christians who argue that a person still having same-sex attraction is not really converted?
Yes,
I can say, in that case, I am not really converted, and I'm pretty sure that I am. You might as well say, a man who is ever attracted to a woman he's not married to isn't really converted. I think none of us would really want to say that, because it's not true. All of the experience of sexual temptation is a common Christian experience. It's what we do with that matters.
Yeah, and I wanted to, I noticed that question as well, and I wanted to point that person to a book that was just came out yesterday, I think. It's called Still Time to Care by Greg Johnson, who's a pastor in St. Louis, Missouri. So if that person is still around, you can check out that book, Still Time to Care. Where was I? I was saying thank you so much. No, that's totally fine. Well, thank you so much for being with us, and good luck on your next writing project that you told me about. And we want to wish you a happy Advent and Christmas season, and hopefully we'll see you next time in person here in Sweden as well.
Thanks, everyone. I look forward to it. Take care.
Thanks. You too. Bye.